The first thing you notice is not his words. It is the way your body tightens before the message even arrives, or before it doesn't arrive. That strange little alert inside your chest, the pause that feels louder than a sentence, the phone on the table, the screen that stays dark, the half-finished thought in your head that says, maybe I should be softer, maybe I should be easier, maybe I should not have said that, maybe I should make this simpler for him. And there it is again, that old reflex. A woman learns very early how to perform softness, not real softness, performance, the kind that smooths over tension, lowers the volume of her own truth, makes her easier to stay near, easier to like, easier to manage. She smiles when something hurts. She explains when silence would have been more honest. She becomes gentle in the places where she is actually frightened. She becomes accommodating where she is actually exhausted. And if the man in front of her brings chaos, that performance grows even stronger. Because chaos does that. It makes softness into a survival strategy. You start speaking more carefully. You choose your words like they are glass. You become the calm one, the understanding one, the one who can absorb the storm without making it worse. You tell yourself that love is patience, love is grace, love is not reacting. So you keep soothing, keep translating, keep forgiving, keep making room for the parts of him that arrive sharp, inconsistent, defensive, unpredictable. But after a while, something in you begins to feel wrong. Not because you became mean, not because you stopped caring, not because you suddenly turned cold for no reason. Something feels wrong because your softness stopped being a choice and became a mask. That is a very different thing. There is a moment many women know too well. You are sitting in a room that looks normal from the outside. Maybe there is a cup of tea going cold beside you. Maybe the room is quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator or the rain against the window. Maybe you are staring at a message you already wrote and deleted 3 times. And in that room, with nothing dramatic happening, you feel the beginning of a private revolt. You realize you are tired of being gentle in a way that costs you your own center. You are tired of making peace with confusion. You are tired of acting like chaos is just a personality quirk. You are tired of explaining your boundaries to someone who treats boundaries like an inconvenience. You are tired of softening your voice so that someone else does not have to face the sound of your truth. And this is where the deeper story begins. Because the issue is not only that he brings chaos. The issue is that your softness has been recruited into his chaos. That sounds harsh, but it is not blame. It is recognition. Carl Jung would have understood this as a problem of the persona, the shadow, and projection. Not in a clinical, detached way, in the lived way, the way a person builds a face for the world, and then slowly forgets where the face ends and the self begins. Your persona may have become the good woman, the easy woman, the woman who does not demand too much, the woman who keeps things peaceful, the woman who can feel the tension in a room before anyone speaks and immediately starts adjusting herself to reduce it. On the surface, that looks like maturity. But sometimes what looks like maturity is actually fear dressed in elegant clothes. Fear of being called difficult. Fear of being left. Fear of making someone angry. Fear of being the reason the connection breaks. Fear of watching the whole thing fall apart if you stop managing it. So you perform softness. You do it because part of you believes that if you are kind enough, patient enough, feminine enough, understanding enough, the chaos will eventually settle. He will soften. He will realize. He will become safe. The room will stop feeling like a storm. But chaos is not always waiting to be soothed. Sometimes chaos is a pattern, and patterns do not change because you become more gentle with them. That is one of the most painful truths a woman can face. Because if you have been trained to believe that your warmth can heal everything, then the moment you stop performing warmth, you do not just feel relief. You also feel guilt. And guilt is very persuasive. Guilt knows how to sound moral. It says, maybe you are too harsh. Maybe you are making it harder than it needs to be. Maybe a softer woman would understand. Maybe if you were more patient, he would stop being like this. But notice what guilt is doing there. It is not always telling you the truth. Sometimes it is protecting an old role. And that is where the Jungian layer becomes important. When a woman has built her identity around being the one who holds everything together, then her softness is not just a personality trait. It becomes part of her persona, a social mask, a way of being that earns approval, reduces conflict, and keeps her connected to people who may not know how to meet her any other way. The danger is that the persona can become so polished that it hides the shadow. And the shadow, in this case, is not cruelty. It is anger. It is exhaustion. It is the part of you that is sick of understanding. It is the part of you that no longer wants to be the emotional container for someone else's instability. It is the part of you that wants to say, I am not here to absorb the consequences of your chaos and call it love. That part does not make you bad. It makes you honest. But honesty can feel terrifying when you have survived by being agreeable. So you keep performing softness. You keep making your boundaries sound like suggestions. You keep wrapping your discomfort in polite language. You keep trying to preserve peace with someone who may only know how to connect through disruption. And then, one day, something shifts. Maybe you stop replying so quickly. Maybe you stop explaining. Maybe you stop fixing the mood. Maybe you stop chasing the conversation after he has made it strange. Maybe you stop pretending that inconsistency is romantic. Maybe you stop calling emotional instability passion. And suddenly, the whole dynamic changes. Not because you became manipulative. Not because you discovered a trick. Not because silence is some magical lever that controls another person. No. It changes because your nervous system has finally stopped volunteering for the role of emotional caretaker. That is a very different kind of power. When a woman stops performing softness for a man who brings chaos, she is often accused, directly or indirectly, of becoming cold. But coldness is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is the body refusing to keep bleeding for a connection that never learned how to hold her gently in return. This is where many people misunderstand the pattern. They think the woman is suddenly changing the relationship, but often she is only revealing the relationship as it already was. The old version of her was covering the cracks with warmth. The new version is no longer willing to stand in the doorway and pretend the house is not on fire. And if he was used to your softness as a buffer, your absence from that role will feel like a threat. Not necessarily because he loved you in the clear, mature sense that love requires. Sometimes because he loved the access, the ease, the emotional labor, the way your gentleness made his chaos easier to live with. That is a hard thing to hear because it touches the ego. His ego, yes, but also yours. The ego wants a story that protects its self-image. It wants to believe that if the connection feels intense, it must be meaningful in the highest way. It wants to believe that if he is inconsistent, he is secretly overwhelmed by feeling. It wants to believe that if you keep being soft, the right version of him will emerge. But Jung would have warned us, in his own way, that projection is dangerous when it begins to wear the costume of destiny. You may not only be seeing him, you may be seeing the image of what you hoped love would be. You may be projecting the possibility of safety onto someone whose behavior keeps interrupting it. You may be carrying an inner image of the man who will finally meet your tenderness without punishing it. And that image can be so powerful that you keep mistaking your longing for evidence. That is not foolishness, it is human. The unconscious loves to repeat what has not been resolved. It takes an old wound and dresses it in a new face. It says, perhaps this time the unstable will become steady. Perhaps this time the withdrawn will become open. Perhaps this time your softness will be enough to transform the whole field. And if you grew up learning that love had to be earned through adaptation, then this pattern can feel almost sacred. You do not just want him. You want the old story to finally end differently. That is why the moment you stop performing softness can feel so emotionally violent. Because you are not only withdrawing from him, you are withdrawing from the fantasy that your self-abandonment is what keeps love alive. Let that land slowly. Sometimes a woman is not afraid of losing the man. She is afraid of losing the role that made her feel necessary. That role can be seductive. It gives structure to uncertainty. It tells you who to be. It makes you feel useful. It gives you a place in the story. If you are the one who calms him, then his chaos becomes your purpose. If you are the one who understands him, then his confusion becomes your job. If you are the one who stays soft, then you never have to ask the harder question. Why do I have to shrink in order to remain close to this person? This is where the shadow begins to speak. The shadow often arrives as irritation, as fatigue, as a dry, almost shocking clarity, as the voice that says, enough. It is the part of you that has been pushed out of your polite identity because it was too inconvenient to be seen. The The shadow says, I am tired of being the only adult in this emotional room. The shadow says, I am tired of translating chaos into tenderness. The shadow says, I am tired of being called difficult for wanting consistency. The shadow says, I am tired of making myself smaller so that someone else can keep avoiding himself. And if you have spent years being the soft one, you may not recognize this voice at first. You may call it bitterness. You may call it a bad mood. You may call it a phase. But often, it is not any of those things. It is the beginning of psychological honesty. The body knows before the mind does. That is why this topic is never just about romance. It is about the body's refusal to keep performing a role that no longer feels true. You can feel it in your shoulders when you read his message and realize you are already preparing your answer around his mood. You can feel it in your stomach when he disappears and you still find yourself making excuses for him. You can feel it in your throat when you swallow what you wanted to say because you do not want to make things worse. You can feel it in your face when you smile through disappointment and call it being understanding. The body keeps a record of every time you made yourself palatable at the expense of your own truth. And eventually, the body stops cooperating. That is often when women say, something in me changed. Yes, it did. Not because you became hard, because your system stopped cooperating with self-betrayal. There is a kind of softness that is healthy. It is warm, clear, and rooted. It does not disappear when challenged. It does not beg for permission. It does not bend itself into a shape that can survive chaos by pretending not to feel it. That kind of softness can say no. It can leave a room. It can sit in silence without panicking. It can love without becoming available for disorder. It can care without turning itself into a container for someone else's unresolved life. That is not coldness. That is maturity. And maturity is often misunderstood by people who benefit from your confusion. If he has been used to a version of you that always absorbs, always explains, always forgives too quickly, then your new calm may unsettle him. Not because you are doing anything dramatic, but because he can no longer depend on your self-abandonment. That is what changes the field. Not games, not tactics, not making him jealous, not becoming mysterious on purpose, not using silence as a weapon. Just the quiet, unmistakable fact that you are no longer available to participate in the same emotional loop. And the loop is usually this. He creates uncertainty, you restore peace. He withdraws, you pursue. He destabilizes, you soften. He gets to remain unexamined while you do the emotional work of keeping the connection alive. When that loop ends, the story becomes clearer, maybe painfully so, because once your softness is no longer masking the chaos, you can see the chaos for what it is. Not all chaos is abuse. Not every unstable man is a villain. But chaos, when it keeps repeating, becomes a relational environment. And no woman is meant to live permanently inside an environment that requires her to disappear in order to maintain it. This is where the question changes. It is no longer, how do I stay soft enough for him to feel safe? It becomes, why have I been treating my own discomfort as less important than his instability? That question is the doorway, because the real wound is often older than the man in front of you. Maybe you learned that being easy made you lovable. Maybe you learned that tension in the room was your fault to fix. Maybe you learned that your needs were too much, your feelings too intense, your boundaries too inconvenient. Maybe you learned that a woman should be graceful even when she is hurt. So when a man brings chaos, your old training activates instantly. You become the one who adapts, the one who smooths, the one who makes it easier, the one who performs softness so that no one has to face the deeper discomfort. But the unconscious is not satisfied with performance forever. At some point, it asks for truth. And truth may sound like this. I am not soft because I am weak. I am soft because I know how to be gentle. But I do not owe gentleness to chaos. That is a powerful sentence, even if you only say it internally, because it separates your character from your compliance. You can be kind and still have a spine. You can be warm and still have limits. You can be loving and still refuse confusion. You can be feminine and still say, this dynamic is not safe for my nervous system. There is no spiritual award for staying available to what breaks you down. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop volunteering. And when you stop, the silence can become very revealing. Silence is a strange mirror. It shows who was relating to your presence and who was relating to your labor. It shows who knew how to meet you and who only knew how to use your softness as a cushion against their own chaos. It shows whether someone was attached to you or attached to what you did for them. That is why silence can feel so uncomfortable at first. It removes the constant movement that kept the illusion alive. No more over-explaining, no more emotional rescue, no more trying to make your boundary sound nice enough to be accepted. No more performing calm while your insides are screaming. Just space. And in that space, the shadow of the relationship becomes visible. The shadow is whatever the relationship did not want to admit about itself. The imbalance, the dependency, the avoidance. The power struggle hidden inside the tenderness, the way one person's chaos was being stabilized by the other person's self-erasure. This is not about turning him into a monster. That would be too simple, and simplicity is often a defense against grief. It is about seeing the pattern clearly enough to stop romanticizing your own depletion, because sometimes women do that. They call it love when it is actually endurance. They call it loyalty when it is actually fear. They call it softness when it is actually self-silencing. And once you see the difference, you cannot unsee it. That is the beginning of individuation, even if it does not feel dramatic. Individuation is not a performance of independence. It is the slow, sometimes painful process of becoming less split inside, less dependent on approval, less willing to confuse harmony with truth, less likely to hand your center to someone else just because they are intense, charming, wounded, or difficult to let go of. A woman in individuation does not need to become icy. She becomes accurate. She learns to tell the difference between compassion and self-erasure, between attraction and projection, between tenderness and tolerance for chaos, between being open and being available for anything. That accuracy can feel like grief because it often arrives after a long period of hoping. You may grieve the version of the connection you kept trying to save. You may grieve the version of yourself that believed if she were gentle enough, she could prevent every fracture. You may grieve the time you spent trying to be the calm in a storm that was never asking to be calmed. That grief is real. Do not rush past it. But do not turn back into the old role just to avoid feeling it. That is the trap. Because the old role feels familiar, and familiarity can masquerade as safety. The old role says, if you go soft again, the tension will ease. If you explain better, he will understand. If you wait longer, he will come around. If you make yourself more pleasant, less demanding, more forgiving, the chaos will quiet down. Yet the body already knows the cost. It knows what it costs to keep smiling while your stomach is in knots. It knows what it costs to keep saying, it's okay, when it is not okay. It knows what it costs to keep yourself emotionally open to someone who repeatedly handles your openness carelessly. So when you stop performing softness, you are not becoming less loving. You are becoming more truthful. And truth, in the beginning, can look like distance. It can look like a slower reply. It can look like fewer explanations. It can look like not rushing to repair what you did not break. It can look like letting his discomfort belong to him. It can look like a quiet face and an unclenched jaw and a decision not to betray yourself just to keep the atmosphere pleasant. That is not punishment. That is boundary. And a boundary is not a wall. It is a line that says, here is where I end, and your chaos does not get to live inside me. Many women have never been taught that boundaries can be gentle. They think a boundary must be sharp, dramatic, cold, or aggressive. But the deepest boundaries are often quiet. They do not announce themselves with speeches. They simply stop participating in what harms the self. There is a dignity in that kind of silence. Not the silence of strategy, not the silence of manipulation, the silence of self-respect. You can feel the difference in your body. Strategic silence is tense. It is waiting. It is calculating. It is secretly hoping for a reaction. Self-respecting silence is calm. It is not trying to provoke. It is not trying to win. It is simply no longer available for distortion. That is what happens when a woman stops performing softness for a man who brings chaos. She stops making herself responsible for the emotional weather of the relationship. She stops carrying the burden of keeping everything smooth. She stops confusing her patience with love when her patience has become a form of self-betrayal. And sometimes, when that happens, he notices. Not always in the way you hoped. Not always with clarity, humility, or real change. Sometimes he notices because the room feels different without your emotional labor. Sometimes he notices because the mirror is no longer flattering his chaos. Sometimes he notices because he no longer has access to the version of you that made his disorder easier to live with. But do not make his noticing the center of the story. That is another trap. The real center is this: you are no longer disappearing to keep a fragile dynamic intact. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself. I am no longer willing to call self-abandonment softness. Let that sentence sit with you, because it contains the whole turning point. The woman who can say that is not hard. She is not bitter. She is not closed. She is not punishing anyone. She is simply no longer willing to confuse her own disappearance with love. And once that happens, the relationship can no longer be the same. Maybe he rises to meet you. Maybe he does not. Maybe he has the capacity to grow. Maybe he stays trapped in his own pattern. You do not need to know that today. What matters is that you are no longer organized around the hope that your softness will save what chaos keeps undoing. That hope is exhausting. It keeps a woman in a state of suspended life, waiting for the next apology, the next calm stretch, the next version of him that feels almost safe enough to trust. But the unconscious does not heal through almost. It heals through truth. And the truth is that your body has been speaking for a long time. It has spoken in the tiredness you could not explain. It has spoken in the dread before opening your messages. It has spoken in the tight smile you wore around people who thought you were just so understanding. It has spoken in the way you felt smaller after every attempt to be more accommodating. That body-level knowing is not dramatic. It is intelligent. It is the part of you that senses when a pattern has become too costly. So now, when you feel the impulse to soften yourself into a shape that can survive his chaos, pause. Do not ask first, how can I make this easier for him? Ask, what happens to me every time I make myself easier for him? That question is a thread back to the self. In Jungian language, the self is not the ego's wishes. It is the deeper center that pulls a person toward wholeness. It often speaks quietly at first, through discomfort, through dissatisfaction, through a refusal to keep playing the role that once protected you but now limits you. The self may not always feel comforting in the beginning. It can feel disruptive. It can feel like the loss of a familiar identity. It can feel like the end of a story you were trying very hard to preserve. But it is not destruction. It is correction. And correction often begins with the simple act of no longer performing what costs too much. So if you are in that place now, if you feel the strange ache of becoming less soft in the places where softness has been used against you, do not shame yourself for it. You are not losing your femininity. You are not becoming numb. You are not closing your heart. You are learning that love without boundaries becomes self-erasure, and self-erasure is too expensive a price for any connection. A woman who no longer performs softness for chaos does not need to become harsh to be safe. She only needs to become clear. Clear enough to notice when her care is being consumed. Clear enough to see when her tenderness is being mistaken for permission. Clear enough to feel the difference between mutuality and emotional labor disguised as intimacy. And once she sees it, she cannot unknow it. The room may still be quiet. The phone may still stay silent for longer than she would like. The door may still feel half open in her mind. But something has changed. The waiting is no longer worship. The confusion is no longer romance. The chaos is no longer a test of her worth. It is just chaos, and she does not have to live inside it. So let the next moment be simple. If he brings disorder, you do not have to become the peacekeeper at your own expense. If he brings confusion, you do not have to translate it into love. If he brings silence, you do not have to fill it with self-doubt. If he brings chaos, you do not have to make yourself smaller so that he can feel larger. You can stay soft in your own life. You can stay open where openness is met with care. You can stay kind without being convenient. You can stay feminine without becoming available for instability. That is the difference. And if one day he looks back and sees you differently, let him. If he doesn't, let that be true too. Because the real victory is not that he finally understands what he had. The real victory is that you no longer need his understanding to know your own value. Your softness was never supposed to be a cage. Your gentleness was never meant to be a tool for surviving someone else's chaos. Your heart was never designed to be a place where disorder could live rent-free. You were meant to be tender without disappearing, warm without collapsing, loving without abandoning yourself. And when you finally stop performing softness for chaos, You do not become less of a woman. You become more of yourself. That is the quiet power that changes everything. Not the power to control him, not the power to make him regret, not the power to force an ending or guarantee a return. Just the power to stand in your own life with a clear face, a steady breath, and a boundary that no longer apologizes for existing. And if tonight the phone stays silent, let your body learn something new from that silence. Not waiting, not chasing, not shrinking. Just this: I am here, and I do not have to perform peace where there is no peace. That is where the return begins. Not to him, to yourself.